The first time I went to a PHA conference, I was talking about the podcast. And still at that time, I'm having to explain what a podcast is and all the steps to go to find it. And I was doing a lot of that. And then I started going to conferences and people are like, oh, you're Dr. Huntley. Oh, wow. I listened to your podcast. I'm like, what? So that would happen year after year. And this last year, I've had different team members go. This last year, I decided that I really need to have more team when we go. I literally could not turn a corner without someone recognizing me or approaching me or wanting to take a picture. And I never say no to it. I mean, I absolutely love it. There was a woman, I have to tell this story. There was a woman who listened to my podcast, and she was a professor. Her name is Suni, I believe. She's a professor in Guatemala. And she listened to the podcast. And I thought, this is crazy.
From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and this is The Pioneer, episode 218, starting a podcast and finding your niche.
You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
Landing in the private industry working as an epidemiologist for a pharmaceutical company is no small feat. Even though it wasn't a traditional government role, there are many skills and invaluable insights that professionals working in the private industry can bring to the public health or nonprofit sector. As fulfilling as this experience was for Dr. Huntley, it wasn't quite enough. She had this creative itch that she needed to scratch, one that would ultimately mean that she would have to pioneer a unique path. What you'll hear in this episode is mine and LaShawn's conversation with Dr. Charlotte Hughes Huntley about her motivation for starting the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast in 2017, before the medium became even more popular as it is recently. She shares her dedication to podcasting and the potential of this tool to pull back the curtain on public health. Dr. Huntley currently serves as the CEO and principal consultant at Dr. C.H. Huntley, LLC, and is a recognized leader in the public health industry. Dr. Huntley is the host of the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast, as I mentioned before, and the newly launched Public Health Entrepreneurs podcast. We start off this episode understanding why she ultimately launched one of the first independent public health podcasts and the role that LinkedIn played in all of this.
And then this lingering thing that it seemed like you've always had about, I'm curious about being creative, exploring business opportunities and meeting people, and to then take all that you've learned. I'm going to start a business and I'm going to look for specific areas that I could bring and serve communities. It's something I'm sure we'll talk about later, but I think it's a theme that we're for sure looking forward to exploring because you've had those varied experiences and thinking strategically about maximizing where you are in your current life, especially with the degree piece. I only need a few more credits to complete this, so I'm going to do it. And just even though you maybe didn't know exactly where you were going, in the moment, you're going to maximize where you are. And I think that's something that was very refreshing to hear. And then that sort of culminated into something I'm very excited to talking to you about is with this, we're not the only podcasters in the world, and we're talking to someone who's done this before even we did this. The OG herself, Dr. Huntley, with the the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast, previously Careers podcast. You mentioned something about, and I will say this, I went back and listened to your first episode, and no, you sounded like a natural. I wouldn't have known that was your first. Was that your first time?
Don't go back and listen to ours.
And I say it because I don't want you to listen to ours. Was pretty horrible. We sounded like some very timid, don't put the mic in my face type of people. But you sounded very mic ready. But in all seriousness, you launched a podcast in 2017 when it wasn't really like the in vogue thing to do.
So I want to get into your head in terms of why you did that and how you stayed connected to the broader public health community to even know that was such a thing that would be valuable to that community. So connect the dots for us.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's really, it's kind of funny when I think about it. It was, I'm a rule follower. Okay. I'll tell you that. Like, so I'm that person. It doesn't matter if you're in the room watching me or not. If mom said, don't do this or don't touch that, I didn't touch it. Or if mom said, follow step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then go to 6, I did all of those steps. I was just that person. That's just the way I am. So I say that to say, and then I also kind of add this little piece. I grew up in a family where we had a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business people, but education was like the foundation. That was like education, you know, that's your ticket out. That's the thing that you do. So that was like drilled into us. But when I was working in pharma, I think although I can articulate all these, you know, benefits and all these, at the time I was doing my job, it was rewarding, but I still felt like I had more to give than I was allowed to or free to do in that role. So I was just kind of, I won't say actively searching for this next thing, but I was very open to maybe I could do something, maybe I could start something, or, you know, just kind of open. And during this time, I've always been, I'm a big advocate of LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn, and I always talk about that as an industry, as public health folks. You guys are maximizing that really well, but too many people, whether they're job seekers or entrepreneurs, we're just not really taking advantage of that platform. Like, there's so much potential on LinkedIn for people in public health, hands
Agreed.
down. So I had a really good profile even way back. I was always putting into optimizing that. So I had a lot of people who would reach out to me on LinkedIn and ask questions about my career. And sometimes it was like, how did you get to this? Or how are you doing that? It was essentially, how did you get that degree and you actually have that job? So I was kind of surprised. That was like the essential they were wanting to know.
Right.
And then they were wanting to ask me questions about, okay, well, I completed my degree. And that's when I realized people were like, I have completed my master's of public health, but I can't get a job. I don't know what to do. So that's what was coming up. It was different people from everywhere, but those were the same general questions. So I would, of course, answer them and engage. And then I just kind of, I guess my scientific mind was like, I wonder if, is this a representative sample of the population? So are there more people out there that had this question? And I'd been a fan of podcasts. So I was listening to podcasts, and because again, I was listening to a lot of business podcasts, and I was trying to just learn stuff, and I was not sure what I was doing, but I was just open. And it literally hit me on a walk. I take long walks in the morning. So I'm like, why don't you just start a podcast and answer these questions and see if people are drawn to that? And I was curious. I was curious to know if I started a podcast and I started answering their questions on a podcast, would it attract those other people out there that had the same questions? And I didn't want to just jump in, and it's easy to start a podcast. You guys are podcasters. There's so much involved with putting together quality and the long haul. So I invested in training. I learned from someone that I had admired as a podcaster and I've been listening to and following. So I got some coaching and training around how to do this. So I thought, if I'm going to invest and start, I'm going to set it up to win just in case it kicks off. And so I set up good systems from the beginning, and I committed to a year. I decided that, you know, I didn't know if I would like it or not. I didn't want to do a few episodes and then not like it and then just quit. I said, good, bad, or ugly, I'll give it a year. All right. So I learned, I trained, and since I'm a rule follower, I did exactly what my coach and what the guidance told me to do. And I just started. I bought what he told me to buy. I set up my systems the way he told me to set it up, and I followed all the steps. I did not even question it for a long time. I didn't start with this really fancy, cool mic. Like, this was the one I always liked, but I started with I forgot what he told me it was. It was like $70, the mic to start with. And it was a great sounding mic. right? And I used it for a long time, but I just set it up and I followed the system. And because I had the system and I wasn't looking to question it, I wasn't focused on that. I was focused on who can I invite next? So I started with answering questions. I had a handful of episodes where I'm answering the main questions people ask me. And then I reached out to anybody that I knew that was in public health and said, could you please be a guest on my podcast and just talk about your journey? Because I realized that people also needed a different view of what careers look like. And it was just, they were just so different. So that's really how it started. And I just got into the flow. It took about, I don't know, maybe a month or two. And I knew I was like hooked. I loved it. And I knew I was going to stick with it. So it didn't take me a whole year to know that I was going to stick with it.
Back to the point about treating LinkedIn as an observational experiment. Dr. Huntley started her podcast to respond to the flurry of frequently asked questions she was receiving on LinkedIn. This way, it allowed her to broadcast her thoughts to a wide audience. The challenge, though, is that podcasting can sometimes feel like a vacuum if you're disconnected from your audience. You hook up your mic, you record a conversation, you publish it, and now it can be accessed publicly. But there's really not an easy and natural way to engage with people who are listening. So I wondered, when did she start feeling validated?
How soon after you started did you get your first sort of random, hey, love what you're doing or love what you said? For us, that's what really feeds us or fed us at the time, where you may be thinking about, should we continue or should we not? When we got that first random email from someone we didn't know, someone who wasn't our friend or family, who we forced to listen to it.
Yes. It didn't take, it didn't take long. I don't remember exactly when, but it was on LinkedIn. I got a message and it was that, I can't remember what, I started getting messages from people in other countries. Right. That's the thing that blew my mind. Because I was like, oh, wow. And it was just like, people would say, and I still get this to this day, people say, thank you for what you do because you inspire me as a woman. I'll get that as a woman doing this. And then I'll get as a Black woman doing this inspires me. And it could be like a young woman I remember from Afghanistan telling me that she decided she was going to step up and lead in her university, start a podcast for the group of friends. And she was inspired for me doing that. And then I started hearing people say that they were inspired because now as a woman, Black woman, and then being a little older. So, the young people, all the millennials and the young people are the ones that are like, we start early and we do all these things and we're expected. This is what people expect us to do. But for someone like me to start, it inspires people in a whole different way. So I started getting kind of those type of messages and maybe a few months into it in LinkedIn. And then that was like, oh, wow. After probably... So when I started, the first time I went to the APHA conference, I was talking about the podcast. And still at that time, I'm having to explain what a podcast is and all the steps to go to find it. And I was doing a lot of that. And then I started going to conferences and people are like, oh, you're Dr. Huntley. Oh, wow, I listened to your podcast. I'm like, what? So that would happen year after year. And this last year, I've had different team members go. This last year, I decided that I really need to have more team when we go. I literally could not turn a corner without someone recognizing me or approaching me or wanting to take a picture. And I never say no to it. I mean, I absolutely love it. There was a woman, I have to tell this story. There was a woman who listened to my podcast and she was a professor. Her name is Suni, I believe. She's a professor in Guatemala. And she listened to the podcast. And I thought, this is crazy. And she reached out to me and we chatted and we did like a Zoom call and we talked. At the last conference, she was there. So this had happened years ago. She had since come to the States and was going through some training and in the States temporarily, but she came to the conference to attend. And we're walking in like the expo hall and she has a very distinct look. Very distinct look. And I recognized her and she came right up to me and I knew exactly who she was. But those moments happen more and more frequently. They never get old for me. They keep me wanting to do more, showing up, because I'll hear things now like, oh, I listened to your podcast and it took me through grad school. It helped me to think about different ways to approach careers, and it helped me, all these examples of people doing different things. It inspired me. So it's like, yeah, I gotta keep going. I gotta keep it going.
More than 300 episodes since the launch of the podcast, the Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast remains one of the most popular podcasts with a public health focus. With so many episodes released, you'd think there might be a shortage of topics to talk about. It turns out that's far from the case.
Super exciting. It's so powerful too. I'm just thinking, like, we're in our respective offices just having a conversation about public health, and real people get inspired and impacted in different ways by this. And just thinking about that gives me chills. It's super exciting. And so you started this podcast in 2017. Can you talk to me about what types of conversations you have and how they've evolved since 2017?
Yeah, they were all, like I said, career related. So I invited people that I knew. As it really started getting popular quickly. I mean, people were catching on, listening, because the other podcasts in public health when I started were academic, like directly connected to the universities. So mine was the first that was just this relatable conversation. And so it was like a disruption. Oh, this is different. And over time, I talked to more and more people, but people started then, wanting to work with me. I did a little bit of one-on-one coaching. That was hard to keep up with because I was working a job and trying to do this. So I did courses and programs. And then I started to get a lot of questions about, well, how are you doing like this thing? What is it? Like the podcast, and because consulting projects, people would reach out to me about consulting projects, and that was starting to show up, and I would say yes or no based on how excited I got about the work or the organization, really. And so people start asking more about well, what is this thing you do and how are you doing this? They wanted to know about the entrepreneur side. So I tested that topic out a few times, and every time I did, there was overwhelming, we follow our own numbers. I don't compare my podcast numbers to somebody else's podcast. I just compare episode to episode and year to year. And I noticed those topics would get so much more attention. So I started with programs and events around this topic of entrepreneurship and exploring. So that was really what people started to get super excited about. And again, back then, nobody was saying, I'm a public health entrepreneur. There were people that were consulting, but they really didn't want to call themselves an entrepreneur. So now it's really cool, but nobody really wanted to say all that then. So I started to get excited about that niche because I love talking about it. It was essentially, I'm creating this thing that for myself that I want. And so I just shared it with people and they could kind of find their own. It was almost like legitimizing it, in a lot of ways. So I started to pivot into that topic. So I changed the name for two reasons. I was Public Health Epidemiology Careers. Epidemiology was in there just because I need people to get comfortable with epidemiology. It's not that everything had to be about epidemiology, but it's how can we have public health without being comfortable talking about epidemiology? Careers, I found people getting more into kind of wanting a formula, like a step-by-step, how do I get this job? And if I do this, how do I get in that job? And they're more focused on the job title than the impact and the work. So I needed the word careers to go away. And I thought conversations fit better because now we're having these conversations that left it a little more open. And so were people being inspired to careers? Absolutely. They were being inspired to entrepreneurship. They were being inspired to break silos in public health and just understand more about what we do and just getting to know each other. So it felt better. And then it just allowed for more space to ebb and flow within these conversation topics. So I still ask essentially the same questions I've always asked. They just kind of frame the conversation. And then, you're at this point with you're almost at 300 episodes yourself. So doing this for so long, it never gets old because every conversation is new and refreshing. And you ask 10 people the same question, you're going to get 10 different stories. So the questions and the framework is essentially the same. It's just, the people. I just kind of change the people all the time, of course.
There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes when you're an avid podcaster. After you've figured out your purpose, your topics, the equipment, and have all the right processes in place, there's a component that remains elusive for many people who have tried podcasting: the consistency. Imagine doing the same thing one day a week for 7 years, without fail. That's what Dr. Huntley has managed to do with her podcast. Every week, you go on the podcast, and there's something new and exciting to listen to.
Well, you must be doing something right. I think as of February 24, 2024, you're somewhere in a 340 episodes ballpark, putting out one new episode every Tuesday for the last 7 years or so. That's I've seen a lot of podcasts come and go.
Dedication and
you're not a come and go podcast.
That's probably the part of me that I want this for more. You can completely relate to what I'm about to say, but I really see the potential for this, for public health to use. And I'm thinking more like entrepreneurs, organizations to really use this platform. If they could just kind of tweak some things and do it really well, it's an incredible opportunity. We've seen some podcasts start and stop, and I'm like, dang, we need more that can last and stay.
Yep. I mean, you started off with that 1 year commitment, and look, you're at 7. So kudos to you, and know that you're inspiring so many people, ourselves included.
It's time for Insight Blitz, the segment where we switch things up with each of our guests to get to know them better as a person. We'll throw out seemingly random questions to get their immediate reactions and responses and see where it takes us. For this one, LaShawn explores a few things, from the most important thing to consider when launching a podcast to who she would have a conversation with if she could interview anyone in the world. The segment comes to a close with Dr. Huntley sharing her thoughts on the most essential skill that an epidemiologist can possess. LaShawn kicks off the segment. Up next.
I want to take a little turn in our conversation, and we're going to go for some Insight Blitz. Basically, it's the segment that we do on our podcast where we're going to ask you some questions or read a couple of statements, and you're going to provide a brief answer. I promise these questions aren't too bizarre. They're pretty straightforward, but we really want to hear your authentic responses to these questions so we could get to know you a bit more.
Okay.
How does that sound?
Okay. A little nervous, but okay.
All right. Let's go. I'll check up on you after the segment to see how you're doing, but let's go. All right. So what is your favorite thing to do in your spare time?
Walking.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned you love long walks in the morning.
Yes. I know that I personally can carry a lot of stress and not realize it. So without having to wait for it to feel somewhere, if I'm walking, I'm moving my body, I'm exercising, I'm helping, all the benefits, but I'm also getting some of that energy release, that stress. So clears my head.
We love that. What is your favorite food to eat?
Oh my goodness. Okay. The first thing that came to mind is pineapple, and I happen to be hungry right now, but I love fruits, and I love the fruits that, like my mom would say, we're not going to buy that. It's too expensive. So now I buy all the fruits that are those tropical fruits, and I love the different colors, but all-time favorite is pineapple.
And do you grill it at all, or you just cut it and eat it?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay.
I think we might have to end the podcast early so Dr. Huntley can make some pineapples.
Grilled with like a little bit of cinnamon. Oh, yeah.
Love it. What is your favorite way to stay up to date with public health news?
That's a good one. I like to... So I am really active in the American Public Health Association, in the Epi section. So staying connected to those, the members and the leaders in that section is probably my favorite way, because it's the top of mind subjects that are closer to my interests. And beyond that, there are some leaders across public health that I especially like. So keeping up with them helps me kind of keep up with those issues and topics.
Great. What's the most important thing to consider when starting a podcast?
Strategy. And I say that because there has to be some, things can go and change all the time, but you need a strategy. You're like what you're doing, why you're doing it, who you're doing it, like that needs to be really clear.
Yeah. If you could choose one person in the history of our world to interview on your podcast, who would it be?
Oh, just one?
Just one.
Don't be greedy, but we'll give you two if you can't narrow it down.
Okay. Honestly, okay. All right, I'm gonna pick one. It would be Martin Luther King. My father, which he passed away before I ever got to know him, was a very big civil rights activist. He did a lot of work indirectly, but with Martin Luther King in that movement, that time. And I have a lot of the men in my family who were the more outspoken ones, did also a lot of work, indirectly kind of connected to Martin Luther King. So if I could just have my own conversation with him and I would love that.
That would be very special. Thanks for sharing that. What would the most essential skill for any epidemiologist be?
Communication.
Not data
almost
analysis
a hot button for me.
and manipulating numbers. No.
Well, because I think they just are. If you're an epidemiologist, you're just good at that. Like you're trained for that. I think the communication is like the big thing I've noticed, because if we cannot communicate this, like even to our peers outside of epidemiologists, just in public health, and then of course thinking outside of the non-scientific community, then we're kind of just, it's not enough to just be talking about it amongst other epidemiologists. We have to, and we don't really have that communication skill. Like it's not really taught, and it's hard to do. Sometimes it's really hard to explain it without being overly complex. So that communication, that skill to communicate within departments and outside teams is really important.
Super important. What is the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Oh, you should give up that thing and just go and get you a real job. I got that advice.
Yeah. Oh, clearly you didn't take it.
Yeah, that was people that didn't understand, or it was a specific person, didn't understand this whole like remote thing and working for a company that seems so elusive and over there, and that didn't seem real to them.
Yeah. If you could make one change to the way we work in public health, what would it be?
That's a hard one to answer. Yeah, that one's hard, because I would say being more innovative. But it's more to it than that, because we've got some innovative people in traditional public health roles, but they feel paralyzed. They can't take the action and make the decisions. So it's like there's multiple things, but we've got to do public health differently.
Yeah, no, totally agreed. And Dr. Huntley, that was the end of our Inside Blitz segment. How did you feel about that? Not too bad, right?
Oh, no, it wasn't bad at all. I was getting into it. I was like, come on, bring me some more.
I threw in some questions on the fly for you, but
the pineapple still was the best
You
answer,
did well.
I think.
Yeah,
that was great. That was great. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Gordon to talk about public health entrepreneurship.
Coming up next, the final chapter in the 3-part miniseries with Dr. Charlotte Hughes Huntley, where we explore the need for innovation in public health and the focus of our consulting company. She also shares more information about the upcoming launch of our new podcast and book focused on supporting public health entrepreneurs. That's next time on The Pioneer, on the Public Health Insight Podcast. This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art designed for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.